Hello, thank you for having me today. I am pretty excited to share some information about safely welcoming guests to open farm days. I just have to say, I love open farm days. I'm a farm kid from here in Saskatchewan. I grew up on a farm, but it was a grain farm, so I always really enjoy going to other farms, mixed farms, or other types of farms, just to see what other producers are doing. And I think what you're doing is really great. So thank you so much for hosting an open farm day. And I'm just going to click over to our QR code for the Canadian Egg Safety Association's website. So feel free to scan that QR code. I am the Director of Programs and Communications. We're a very small, not-for-profit national organization working to ensure that no one is hurt on the farm. So that's what we do. We're pretty excited to be able to share some information. We have some really great programs out there. We have things to borrow, lots of resources, coloring pages if that's of interest to you for your open farm days. All sorts of things on there that if you want to borrow them, grab them, please feel free to do so. You can also contact me at any time. I see I neglected to put my email address up there. But if you go to the Contact Us webpage, you can find me there and you can definitely shoot me an email or at info@casaaxa.ca. So, I guess we should just start about why farm safety matters for open farm days. One of our programs is the Canadian Agriculture Injury Reporting program, and that works with a cohort across Canada, and that is a volunteer cohort that visits coroners' offices and gathers information about agricultural injuries and deaths. Well, fatal injuries, I should say, not non-fatal injuries. And that results in a care report that comes out every 6 to 7 years, kind of depending on, how fast we can collect that data, how fast it can be verified, and that sort of thing. So this is one of the charts that you can see from the Canadian Agriculture Injury Reporting. And this is about who is killed in agriculture-related incidences. And as you can see, mostly it's the owner-operator that is killed, unfortunately, due to an agriculture-related incident. But this is to say that no one is exempt from an injury on the farm. And this obviously includes visitors. So we need to make sure that, everyone on the farm, we live there, work there, play there, or come to visit, we're safe. And the other thing is that farm safety matters for open farm days is because we're welcoming the public onto working farms. And, your farms are active workplaces with real hazards, livestock, and infrastructure. And, most of the incidents involve, the farm owner operators, people working on the farm, but there's also members of the public that are coming onto your farm that can be also at risk. And they are at risk mostly because they might not understand the hazards that are is associated with a working farm. So there are, additional risk factors when we welcome the public to our farms. Like I said, visitors are unfamiliar with the hazards. There's reduced control over movement. We don't maybe sometimes know what they're doing or where they're going. There might be reduced supervision of our visitors, and there could be increased interaction between people, animals, and machines. So for many farm visitors, many of our visitors in open farm days, this might be the first time they've ever been on a working farm. So what they experience can shape how they think and feel about farming long after they leave. So we want to give them a really good impression of farming. We want to make sure that the producers are the voice of agriculture. So this gives these visitors an opportunity to hear directly from the people who live, work, and grow their food. Live and work on the farm and grow their food. So safety plays a really crucial role in creating a positive experience for those visitors. So if they feel welcomed, informed, and safe, they're more likely to relax, ask questions, engage with the experience, and then share that positive story as they leave the farm. So a safe experience is a positive experience. So we want to make sure that they have an incredibly great time and are very safe as they get to enjoy, your farm and get to see how hard you work and how wonderful your farm is. So, as a farm owner operator, you're responsible for keeping every visitor safe on your property. So when you're inviting those folks to a working farm environment, it's definitely your responsibility to take reasonable steps to keep visitors safe. So we're going to talk through this presentation about how we can make sure that your visitors have a positive and safe experience. So this is just a bit of what we're going to cover. So we're going to talk about common risks associated with hosting visitors, developing a visitor welcome orientation, establishing visitor boundaries and traffic flow, preparing for emergencies, and overall creating a safer open farm days experience for your visitors. So, one of the most important things is, a lot of your visitors are not farmers. They may not have ever once again worked visited a working farm. And they might not understand that farms are both homes and workplaces with lots of ongoing activities, machinery, equipment, livestock, and other hazards. Um, they might not recognize really common farm hazards, things that might seem obvious to someone that, grew up or lives or works on a farm. They might not seem obvious to your visitors. Things like electric fences, how livestock are behaving, how equipment moving, blind spots, um, what the grain hazards could be, even, things like crop protection products or chemicals, even as something as simple as uneven ground. It might not appear like it could be a hazard to these not to non-farm folks, but we definitely know that these can be hazardous and can cause injuries. So we want to think about that. Lots of times, people visiting in open farm days might probably attend with young children, right? So, kids are naturally curious and excited, and they're often drawn to animals, machinery, and other hazards. So they might run or climb, or wander, or touch things that they're not supposed to without understanding the risks. So it's important to communicate expectations clearly to parents and grandparents and other caregivers that the children that they bring on to your operation on their farm must be supervised at all times. And of course, you might end up with large groups of visitors all at once, right, throughout the day. And this can make it really challenging to make sure that everybody that comes on the farm gets the information they need around safety and they understand where they can and cannot go. So that is definitely a challenge. And then also consider, what happens if visitors arrive while you're on a tour or your open farm days that come and go. So is there a designated parking area, a greeter or a volunteer there to welcome them, a signage explaining what to do next, and planning, just pre-planning on how your visitors will arrive, gather, and move around the farm can help prevent confusion and reduce the likelihood of injuries. So, the one of the best things you can do when you're preparing for your open farm day is to look at your farm through the eyes of a first-time visitor. What hazards on your farm have become so routine or normal that you might not realize a visitor wouldn't recognize them. So we talked about some examples like electric fences. I grew up with electric fences. We knew, what they would zap you. But, a lot of folks, they might not know that that fence is electrified. And, children in particular, may want to get close, touch it, livestock behavior. When you see a gorgeous cow, or you see a beautiful horse, or you see a goat, or as just a person from the general public, you might see them. They might see them as friendly pets. They might think, oh, they're just so adorable, and they want to get up close and interact with those animals, but they might not know that even calm appearing animals can be unpredictable, and they probably won't recognize the signs of stress, fear or aggression in livestock. So, definitely making sure visitors should be supervised around animals and told which animals they may approach. I think that's really important. Farm machinery, tractors and equipment can be really fascinating. I know for kids, for adults, everybody's really intrigued by farm equipment, all sorts of machinery. They might want to get in it. They might want to crawl on it. They might want to look at the controls, those sorts of things. So, securing your equipment, removing keys, and communicating that machinery is off limits, unless specifically included in your farm tour, is really essential. There's things like uneven surfaces, ruts, mud, gravel, hoses, cords are all part of a farm life. It's kind of goes part and parcel. But keeping in mind that visitors might show up wearing inappropriate footwear, right? You might have folks wearing flip-flops and Birkenstocks, or boots with big heels or who knows, right? So keeping Crocs, you probably see a lot of Crocs. So keeping in mind that, you want to make sure that you're identifying and managing any slip, trip, and fall hazards along visitor routes as best as you can, or even signing that there is uneven ground, that sort of thing. So keeping that in mind, grain bins and augers, right? These are everyday types of things on our farms, but they might look like interesting apparatuses to climb or explore. So they a lot of times visitors might not understand that a grain bin is a confined space, or that grain engulfment can happen when grain's in motion. So, keeping visitors away from grain handling facilities and areas, and clearly identifying these as restricted zones is a great idea. So, it's up to us as people hosting people on our farm to identify hazard and communicate it if it can't be controlled. And a lot of hazards obviously can't be controlled. We can't just get rid of our tractor, obviously, but making sure that we're controlling that hazard by, putting other controls in place like, signage, lockout, tagout, those sorts of things. And these are just really examples. There are plenty of other hazards that exist on farms. Hazards are just as unique as each farm is unique. So taking a look, through the eyes of someone that's never been on your farm to just identify those hazards, think about how you could control them, and then if you can't control them, how you can communicate them to your visitors. So, your responsibilities host, duty of care, of course, planning ahead, supervision, and communications. So you have a responsibility to take reasonable steps to protect your visitors from foreseeable hazards. And like I said, it doesn't mean eliminating every hazard or, eliminating every risk, but it does mean identifying them and taking appropriate action to prevent any injuries. So ask yourself, have I done everything reasonable to make this visit safe? Planning ahead. This happens now, and this is why we're having this now, right? Your open farm days aren't until August, but now's the time to start thinking about this. So long before your visitors start arriving, this is when you can start really taking a look, and walking through, thinking about that visitor experience, from arrival, when they get there to when they leave, and identifying those potential hazards. Supervision is pretty important, especially children should never be left to explore the farm unsupervised. So, of course, communicating that the farm isn't a playground to your visitors, so that can make sure that they keep an eye on their own children. That's really important. I would suggest, making sure that there's enough, of your own family or staff or volunteers on your farm available to act as guides, people to answer questions, and overall just kind of monitoring the visitor behavior so that, if something is happening that isn't safe, they're able to correct that in real time as opposed to waiting for something to happen. So, having enough bodies on the ground to help out with that is pretty essential. And of course, never assuming that visitors are going to understand the rules right off the hop or understand the hazards. So, that clear communication of like where visitors can and cannot go, how they can safely interact with animals and which animals they can interact with, areas that are firmly off limits, and emergency procedures where folks can go in case of an incident. This can be done in a variety of ways. It can be verbal instructions, signage, maps, and then of course physical barriers, right? You can string up a barrier, do not go zone around, potentially areas that you don't want people to enter. So if you think of your chem shed or something like that, or signage, right? Stop, do not enter kind of things. And then, repeating that information in a variety of ways throughout the visit really helps ensure everybody receives that. So, a verbal discussion of it, signage, barriers, using a variety of different communication methods can really help folks kind of understand and see those hazards and risks, and then follow those safety rules. So, before have your open farm day, just, I would suggest taking a look at your liability insurance. So not all farm policies automatically cover, public events or visitor activities, and some activities like a wagon ride, demonstrations, animal interactions may require additional coverage or amendments. So, confirm this well in advance with your provider. And that's pretty important. You want to make sure you're covered. And I'm sure that Food and Farm Care, has some information on that as well. It's also really important to notify anybody on the farm, so farm workers, family members, you know, volunteer staff, you know, that this is happening, and they should all know some specific things like when are the visitors coming, what when to expect them, which areas are open for visitors, which ones are restricted, how any farm operations might need to be adjusted that day. If you have livestock, obviously you can't just stop working that day. They need to be fed. They need to be looked after. So, you know, making sure that, you know, you adjust those working conditions around that visit, and what their role is in keeping your visitors safe. You know, it's also really important to designate parking areas. That helps control traffic flow, and reduces the risks of visitors entering high risk zones, like, you know, around, you know, equipment that might be moving or near livestock, you know, corrals or things like that, or other active work areas. You know, and clear signage and visible directions here are key. You know, also making sure that people, you know, having an attendant at that parking, if you expect a lot of folks, isn't a bad idea because, as we know, for some reason, parking lots become a bit of an issue, you know, when people are coming in and out. So, you know, making sure that someone's there to kind of maybe direct that traffic flow, ensure folks are slowing down, taking it easy when they're doing their parking, that sort of thing. It's not a bad idea. You know, establishing hand wash stations is essential, especially if, you know, you've got a visit where your visitors might be interacting with animals. You want to make sure that they are able to find them. They're clearly marked, and that they're fully stocked, right? So sometimes, you know, they can run out of, you know, paper towel or hand soap, those sorts of things. So, you know, assigning someone to check those hand washing stations regularly is a really good idea to help ensure that folks are able to use that and get what they need from those hand washing station. And then, you know, finally assigning greeters and other volunteers to manage arrivals. You know, that is a really effective way to prevent confusion, right, from your visitors. So they can welcome the visitor, say, we're so happy you're here. Welcome to our farm. You know, where we do these things at our farm, and we're really, you know, these are the things you can expect. And then this also is a really good opportunity to give them a basic farm safety orientation, a welcome. And then that way you can also make sure that they get that information. They get the information like where the washrooms are, where the designated, you know, muster point is in case of an emergency, who to look for in case of an emergency, those sorts of things. So, you know, having somebody there that greets folks, and just says hello, and it could even be your parking attendant, right? Just as the people come in, you know, 30-second, 45-second conversation about things, just to get that visit off on the right foot. So, I had a colleague from Manitoba, and I talked to her. She works for the Keystone Egg Producers and Farm City Manitoba, and she's done some work with their open farm day. So I said, what are some challenges that you heard, you know, when you did a bit of a review of things, of issues around open farm days, and these were some things that came up fairly commonly. Was, you know. One of the most common things was visitors wandering into work areas or restricted zone. And it seemed to happen when they arrived early, so before anybody was ready for them. They came kind of between tours. So if you're hosting a tour, they you know, people kind of show up and then they didn't have anything to do, so they would wander around, or they just didn't understand where they were supposed to go. So, you know, we can mitigate that by having clear boundaries and greeters, because without that, visitors will just, they're so excited to be on your farm. So they're ready to explore, and they might end up in spots where you don't want them in, or where there could be a hazard, those sorts of things. So, you know, that's definitely a challenge. Another challenge, of course, is mixing farm equipment and visitor traffic. So, you know, like I said, you know, if you've got a working farm, you can't stop work that day, especially if you've got livestock. So, you know, that mix of, you know, pedestrians wandering through traffic can really create high risk situations. Also, collisions between, you know, farm equipment and motorists can also be a hazard. Even when, everyone is moving slowly, if it's an unusual situation, right? So people aren't used to this kind of, high traffic happening, near a farm for that farm equipment operator. And those motorists probably aren't that familiar with farm equipment either. So understanding that. So, um, you know, that is also definitely a bit of a challenge. Um, and then visitors obviously arriving and don't know what to do. They don't know where to go, they don't know who to talk to. So if there's not a welcome, a greeting, you know, they might scatter. They might not know what to do. They might go to unsafe areas. They might interrupt farm work, just trying to find direction. So, once again, having that greeter, being able to communicate clearly about where to go, the routes, those sorts of things, is pretty important. And then also having animals and rough handling of animals, especially where children are involved. I don't know if you've heard of cute aggression. They get so excited about how adorable, a baby, a chick is, or a little bunny, or, whatever that farm animal might be. And they might not understand that, they have to be fairly gentle. And, visitors, especially that don't have familiarity with farm animals or livestock, might not understand, stress signals, what an animal's doing when it's clearly signaling it's had enough. So it can lead to both injuries of the animal, which we do not want, and the people. So, making sure that, there's that supervision around any interaction between any farm animals and your visitors. So, the one theme about all of these challenges is that it's just really unclear expectations and a lack of control at arrival points, is really tends to be, and lack of supervision tend to be kind of the common themes. And, and it's not because of bad intentions. None of your visitors, are probably coming out there to, get in the way or handle an animal roughly. It's just they need to be communicated with, they need to be supervised, and there need to be boundaries put in place. So, once again, I just want to take, that safety mindset of like how we might normally use a farm to how a visitor might experience this farm. So, just once again, thinking about, those hazards might not be obvious. So if they are not clearly understood, marked, or restricted, they could potentially put themselves at risk. So I just really would like to, hammer this point home that, they might not recognize the risk. A dugout can look incredibly inviting, right? Um, you know, there's so many very tiny dugouts out there that just look beautiful. And, you could end up with people wandering too close to that water's edge. They might, want to get, close to that animal. They might want to climb that piece of equipment. They might want to go into a building. So just really just keep that in mind, before you, welcome your visitors. So what we can do is create a visitor welcome orientation. And of course, every farm is different. So when you create a welcome and orientation, make sure it fits your farm. This is a strawberry farm just outside of Portage La Prairie, and they welcome hundreds of visitors to their farm every year to do strawberry U-pick, right? So the hazards on that farm are definitely different than, the hazards of a mixed farm or the hazards of a grain farm, the hazards of an orchard. So, every farm is incredibly different. So, keeping that in mind that, one size doesn't fit all, just like every farm is so different, these also need to be, customized to your operation. So when you create a visitor welcome orientation, it should be really short, simple, and consistent, like memorable, easy to understand, and it should be the same information should be relayed to every visitor. And it could be just start with basic safety rules and policies. So, where you can go, where you can't go, what the rules are for interacting with animals, and then what to do in case of an emergency. So it's you're not there to give them, you know, the high level, intense training on a farm life, but just giving them those key safety rules that they need to know and what to expect. So that would include like your rules and expectations. So once again, depending on your operation, it could be different, right? But here are some pretty generic ones that I feel are pretty appropriate for all farms. Children must be remain supervised. No climbing on the machinery. Stay with the group. Respect fences and barriers. Use the cell phones in designated areas only, and follow instructions from your farm hosts. And they should be easy to repeat, right? So that everybody, all your volunteers, staff, anybody in your farm, can talk to anybody that's visiting and say, hey, these are the rules, just so you know. Also, you consider posting these, right? This would be a good another way to have that conversation. So you could tell them, post it as well. That would be a really great way to continue to that conversation. And I just want to iterate that some of your visitors might not have English as a first language, and or might not be able to read well. So making sure that those folks can also access this information is pretty important. So that's why it's important to maybe have more than one delivery mode for these sorts of these rules and expectations. You want to make sure you're inclusive to everybody that comes as a visitor to your farm. And then this is where you can identify hazards to those to your farm visitors, and then you can tell them what they are. So it could be once again restricted areas that need PPE. So maybe you are inviting farm visitors to come into an area where there might be a lot of noise. And this is where you're going to provide hearing protection. So, making sure that they understand that. So you want to make sure that they understand that, if they are going to be entering these areas, there is PPP, this is what they need to wear, this is how they wear it. That's definitely something to think about. Maybe you will let them come into areas where they need to close covered shoes, but you need to make sure that then they are wearing those shoes before they're allowed to come in those areas. Of course, you don't want to talk about areas where there might be busy traffic, farm traffic, area where there might be dust or fumes, eye hazard areas, and places where they can slip and trip. So, because if visitors can't recognize a hazard, they can't avoid it. So if you can't eliminate a hazard before they come, you must communicate it to those visitors and tell them how to avoid it. This clear communication will take that risk and turn it into a safety boundary, right? So making sure that they understand those things. You want to make sure that you have, boundaries and visitor routes. So where your visitors can go and how they can move through your farm. So that can reduce confusion and prevent people from entering, hazardous areas or high risk areas. We want to make sure that the parking once again is clearly marked, so it's that first point of entry. First kind of welcome to the farm is where they're going to park, so wanting to make sure that you direct them away from like active farm operations, livestock areas, those sorts of places. And of course using like signage and once again if possible having someone assigned to welcome them to the parking area, to guide those arrivals. You want to make sure you have a designated gathering area. So where maybe people can check in, or a meeting point where visitors are welcome and oriented. So that could, and that could be where you have your signage. That's where you could have another volunteer. Maybe that's where you put your porta potties and hand washing stations, right? So it's kind of a natural gathering spot for people to go, get information, have someone there that they can check in with, that sort of a thing. And it guarantees that everyone coming will get that information they need before, starting their true visit. You want to make sure that, deciding in advance whether your visitors will move in groups with tours, or they will follow a self-guided route or path. A guided tour obviously gives you more control and communication, but that can be really hard, with open farm days if it's a come and go kind of a thing. So anything that's a self-guided route, would require, clear signage, boundaries, and simplified instructions. So making sure that they know exactly where they're supposed to be going, and they're not easily confused, or can deviate off of that path, fairly easily. So making sure that they know exactly where they need to be at all times. And obviously, either option should be planned to avoid, active work zones. physical barriers are an excellent way to prevent folks from going into places you don't want them to go. So fences, gates, ropes, those sorts of things, just to clearly, make a visual separation from visitors to restricted areas. It's a really strong visual cue that helps prevent that entry into those zones. And you want to make sure that you have those around things like, um, chem sheds, maybe livestock pens or areas, even around maybe you have a designated spot where you're parking your farm equipment at that time. So those are really good, eye places where you could use some boundaries, just to kind of give that visual cue of, that's a no-go zone area. And then, of course, having simple, good directional signs. It should be really easy to read. It should potentially use iconographs, so uh, arrows, those sorts of things, bathroom signs, those sorts of things, so that they can be easily understood and accessible. They should be large enough for folks to be able to read, to see, and they should be really consistent. And they should be plentiful, right? So having lots of signs as opposed to just having a few signs gives folks the opportunity to see them and read them. So, it's simple words like "do not enter," those sorts of things with an X cross through it, right? Those sorts of things. And it helps cut down on that need for continual verbal direction, and gives visitors kind of those visual clues that they really need to see to understand, where they can and cannot go. Um, Another thing we want to make sure is that, between visitors and animal interactions, that they are managed properly. You want that to be a really safe and positive experience for your visitor and for your livestock. So, once again, clearly identifying which animals they may visit and may touch. And, not all animals will be accessible or oftentimes to visitors, right? You might have animals that, they're skittish, maybe they're have a new young one. Maybe they are sick. These are all animals that probably shouldn't be accessible to visitors. So those animals should be, kept, safe, maybe separate from the other animals that are part of that visitor experience, and just to avoid the assumption that the visitors will know which animals are safe to approach. Um, and keeping once again signage, boundaries, those sorts of things are is pretty important. And it's I would suggest having a supervised animal interaction. I wouldn't suggest letting them just have a free for all with the animals. You know, for the animal safety as well as the visitor safety. Should be somebody that is a trained in animal behavior, understands those animals pretty well, just to make sure that everybody's safe, including the livestock and the visitors. And then this can help with that quick correction of any unsafe behavior. That could be, chasing an animal, rough handling, maybe even, feeding an animal, unauthorized, food, that sort of thing. So, that I would definitely suggest making sure that is a supervised area, a closely supervised area. And of course, making sure that there is hand washing stations available after anyone's, had contact with any livestock. Um, Around farm equipment should always be treated as a controlled hazard during open farm days. So keeping those boundaries and controls, physical controls are essential to keeping visitors safe. So removing all keys from any powered equipment, tractors, loaders, it doesn't matter, skid steers, making sure that those keys are removed. That's the best, easiest way to, stop unauthorized use or startup. Lowering any loaders or attachments is a good visual cue that that machine is not in operation, and it also prevents visitors from walking underneath anything that might be raised, any buckets or things like that, just to keep them. That's definitely a crush hazard, so keeping those things lowered is a really good way to prevent that kind of injury. And then, of course, blocking access. So, if you were like, okay, we're going to put all these machines in the Quonset, or put them in the shed, park them elsewhere. And then, of course, you can always use barriers, to keep them away from those pieces of equipment. I wouldn't always rely on verbal instructions about staying away from the equipment. It's signage, those sorts of things can really help. You communicate that with your visitors that this is a no-go area. If you are having demonstrations with equipment, it's really important to separate the demonstration area from the viewing area. So, once again, putting up a barrier, it's a great idea. A rope, hay bales, just making sure that those spectators are at a safe distance so they can understand where they can see, stand, and then stay safe. And then, of course, once again, establishing an exclusion zone. So, clearly defining and marking areas around equipment where visitors are not permitted. This should be enforced throughout your event. And it helps, once again, um, you know, really just prevent folks from getting in situations that they should not get themselves into. Especially kids, right? They tend to want to get close to this stuff. And if that machine ends up in motion, we could definitely end up with a real tragedy. So those are really important things around, sorry, excuse me, around farm equipment and visitors. So this is a really great little tool I found on the Sask Open Farm Days in the tools for hosts. And it's just an emergency preparedness template. And I would really suggest that, you have this done not only just for Open Farm Days, but for any time on your farm. I think taking that time to really have that conversation, make sure that everybody understands what to do in case of an emergency really gives you that leg up in being prepared in advance should, to be able to respond quickly in case something does go wrong. Um, so things like emergency contacts, who do you call? So, right, local fire services, local emergency services. Who is the lead? Who's the farmer owner operator that should be notified emergency? Who are on-site folks at that on the ground who can respond to emergencies? And I would really suggest not making sure that everybody might have this digitally, but also posting it in kind of key locations. So putting it in a couple spots. Maybe you have a first aid kit, fire extinguisher, eye wash station somewhere, maybe in your shop. Well, this would be another thing to post there as well, just to have that, kind of, so you're not depending on something digitally. Sometimes cell phone service isn't always great. Wi-Fi might not be extended into the farmyard from the house. Maybe there is no Wi-Fi, right? Those sorts of things. So this is a really good thing to maybe consider posting in those key locations. Maybe having them in, farm trucks, those sorts of things as well. Also having established emergency assembly points for visitors, and communicating that along with your in your orientation, saying, if there isn't a situation, please, gather here. Maybe you have that muster point signed. And so everyone can see where that spot is. It should be really easy to find. It should be accessible. They shouldn't have to climb a hill to get there, or go down a gully, or navigate around somewhere that might be hard to get because some of your visitors might have physical limitations. That might lead them to not being able to move that quickly, or to get to spots that might be hard to muster to. And they of course should be located away from any hazards. And everybody on the day of, so your volunteers, any family members, they all should know where people should go in case of an emergency. Um, You'll also want to make sure your first aid supplies are stocked and up to date and easily accessible, and they should be in different key areas once again. So, depending on how many folks are coming to your event, you anticipate how big of a farm you have. These should be in different areas, and everybody should know exactly where they are and how to get to them pretty quickly. Also identifying who is trained in first aid. Just, to make sure that if there is that something does happen, you know who you can call first off, to come and give you a hand. And, ideally, if you do have a larger event, that these folks are spread across your farm so that, in case there is an incident, it doesn't take a long time for someone to get to the emergency. Also, we live in Saskatchewan. There was a funnel cloud here in Saskatoon the other day. There is hail. There is big time like plow winds, right? There's thunderstorms that kind of come out of nowhere. Sometimes the wind blows 100 miles an hour. Sometimes it's, 35 degrees. So thinking about what to do in case you have, severe weather. When to pause any tours, where visitors can shelter in case they need to shelter in case of some extreme weather, or when to call it when it's like, okay, enough is enough. We got to cancel this because things are not safe. So understanding those sorts of things. So having a bit of a plan about what to do in case of those extreme weather events is pretty important. Um, yeah, you don't want a bunch of folks stuck on your farm if there is, you know, a big thunderstorm or a hailstorm or heaven forbid a tornado come through. So having those plans in place is pretty important. Um, Once again, you might have a lot of kids come out to your farm, really excited. They want to see things. And, even though we've communicated to parents and caregivers that they have to keep an eye on their kids, sometimes kids are fast and mischievous, and they might go missing. So, what do you do in case somebody does lose their child? What happens if a kid, gets out of sight of folks, out of their parents? So, having a clear procedure about responding to a missing child is pretty important. So, who gets notified? What is your search area and coordination plan? How do you communicate if you found the children? So, once again, prevention here is really key. Really, we want to make sure that those kids are supervised, that there are physical boundaries up around significant hazards, like, water hazards is one I'm definitely thinking about, and machinery. Care data does talk about how kids are killed. They're most likely to be ran over, and they also drown and are killed by livestock. So those are, high risk areas. So just keeping that in mind, to make sure that those parents understand that, and that, there are boundaries around those places where we really don't want those kids. And of course, we want to make sure that everybody knows where any safety data sheets are located, just in case there are for any chemicals that might be on site. Um, you know, Once again, these chemicals should be no-go zone areas where they're stored. But if somebody does end up, getting into them somehow, making sure that people know where to access that information, in case you do have to respond to that kind of an emergency. So, we're going to be wrapping up here pretty shortly, but I just would like to just consider a few really things. Seeing your farm day from your visitor's eyes and planning that entire experience around safety from their arrival to their departure. So, where they arrive. This is where, you set the tone for the entire visit. So what do they see first? They see a really wonderful person saying, "Hello, welcome to our farm. We're so glad you're here." Just a couple of farm safety, rules we want to talk about. Having that really positive, like first off the pop experience of being like, "Yes, you know what, we're going to set up expectations right away, give clear instructions, know what to expect, know what to do in case of an emergency." um, you know where will they park? That's, often the first major control point for safety, right? We talked about how, this can be a high risk zone, so making sure that, an attendant is potentially there to kind of direct folks where to park, how to park, making sure that that parking zone is away from any farm equipment, livestock areas, and anywhere where active farming is occurring. Making sure that it's signed. That's really important. where they wait. If they're coming onto the farm and they're waiting for the tour, where do they wait? What do they see? What do they experience? So they're not wandering around or going off to other non-exclusion zones or no-go zones. And if it is self-directed, this also is a spot where they can kind of muster at, see all the information, and then continue on their visit. Um, where hazard exists. We just spent a lot of time talking about, seeing your farm through the eyes of a first-time visitor. So identifying those hazards, where we might not think they're hazards. We might think they're just everyday, total farm, normal things, but making sure that we identify them and then doing something about them. And a lot of the times that is communicating them, creating boundaries, eliminating the hazard if we can, keeping that in mind. And then, of course, where confusion can occur. So if someone's confused, that could lead them to risky behaviors. So, look for places where visitors might not know where to go, where they might end up leaving a tour group, where they might enter a restricted area, inadvertently, or where they might miss safety instructions. So simple signage, continual conversations, clear routes, and visible staff, volunteers, family members, volunteers, just to be able to say, hey, you've gone off route. It's time to get back this way. Those can all help clear up confusion. So just a quick little checklist, right? Make sure your insurance is confirmed. Make sure you've got your hazards identified and controlled if you can. You've briefed your family members, any staff, any volunteers that you've got coming on board to help out. You've got your orientation prepared. You've got your routes established, your signs installed, your emergency plan reviewed, and communicated with anybody that'll be there. So your volunteers, staff, family members, and of course, making sure you've got hand washing available. So, you can have you will have an incredibly safe visit. I know you can, I'm so excited for your open farm days. I was looking at the list thinking, oh my goodness, I hope I can make it to at least, I want to make it to all of them, but I definitely am excited to see, your farms. So, having a safe visit requires a little bit of planning. Making sure that that visitors might not recognize those farm hazards. Communication supervision is essential. Boundaries and emergency planning are important. And of course, a safe experience is a positive experience for people coming to your farm. And I just want to leave you with a couple of resources. The first one is from the Canadian Centre for Health and Safety in Agriculture, and the network out of the University of Saskatchewan. And it's a new guide to a farm safety plan. Even if, this might be impetus for you to start a farm safety plan for your farm. And I would highly suggest everybody have a farm safety plan, not just for your open farm day, but for all the times. You are important. You grow our food. You look after the livestock. You're the stewards of the land. You're important. So, having that farm safety plan to protect yourselves, your farm, your family is really just one of the biggest gifts you can give yourself and your farm. So I would really highly encourage you to take a look at that, contact the Canadian Centre for more information if you're interested. You can also contact us. We can absolutely connect you with folks on the ground that can help you with that. And I've also included a hazard assessment tool that CASA has put together that can help you maybe do that pre-tour of your farm, taking that look of hazards through, a visitor's eyes and seeing how you could potentially control those hazards before any injuries might occur. So I'm all done. So I just want to say thank you so much for having me today. It was great to be able to share this information with you, and I hope you all have incredibly successful and safe open farm days.